Hi guys, welcome to today's watercolor tutorial. I'm going to share some easy and effective tips for painting this large loose flower. I'll show you how to achieve this using minimum tools and colors. Let's talk about the materials I'm using for this painting. For the paper, I'm using 300 GSM cold press 100% cotton watercolor paper, which handles water well without buckling too much. If you're using a different type of paper, that's totally fine, since we're mainly using the dry brush technique. However, thinner paper may buckle around the flower center when I use more water there. I do recommend using the type of paper I mentioned if you're just starting out with watercolor, as it makes things much easier compared to other types of paper. The brushes I'm using today are quite simple. The thin round brush is from Da Vinci. Whilst these petals look quite large, there's no need for a very thick brush. Actually, I think thinner brushes offer better control for this technique. I also use a black velvet brush with a fine tip for the detailed work in this painting. For colors, I'll be using primarily Quinacridone permanent rose, a touch of permanent yellow light from Mijello, and a bit of Ivory black. Now let's start with our first technique, dry brush. This is the key to creating texture in our petals. I'm starting with a clean dry brush and rehydrating the paint in the tin. When using paint from a tin, you must be careful with the amount of water. Too much will ruin the dry brush effect we're aiming for. Here's how to test if you have the right consistency. Try it on a square piece of paper first. If your strokes look like this, with some texture, then you're ready to begin. To paint the first petal, I'm holding the brush with a loose grip and making multiple strokes in roughly the same direction. Notice that I'm not trying to create a solid block or an even spread of color. The key is to create several distinct strokes. I'm leaving a small gap between each petal. One important thing to remember is that petals in nature aren't identical. Varying the shape and depth of color makes the flower look more natural. If you're unsure about the shape and depth, starting with a thinner layer, we can always add some more depth later. And now I'm continuing with the same technique. I'm rinsing my brush and picking up some yellow. I'll add a couple of strokes along the inner edges of the petals and bring the color into the center of the flower. I'm dampening my brush and wetting the center of the flower, then dabbing in some yellow paint here and there while still wet. I'm using a slightly damp brush to soften the yellow on the petal. Now I'm using thick red color this time and dabbing it into the yellow areas at the center. Be careful not to completely cover the whole yellow area, because we want that lovely transition between colors. Also, ensure your brush isn't too wet, otherwise the right area will develop unnatural backgrounds and block this. Let's add some depth to the petals now. I'm using the same brush after working on the center. Since the brush is slightly damp at the moment, my strokes come off softer than the first layer of the petals I painted with the dry brush technique. This is a very flexible per size, so we can just paint without overthinking it. Even if the paint doesn't go your way, you can still refine it easily. The only potential mistake I see is accidentally overworking the petal with too many strokes, covering the whole area without any blanks or texture, or using too much water on your brush, which can lead to a wet stroke effect. This can make the color look flat and rigid. It may also happen if your brush is too thick for the flower you're painting. Unlike typical wet brush techniques though, we can naturally cover our mistakes. I'll show you how later in this video. Once the flower is completely dry, I'm adding detail to the center. I'm dabbing a bit of black onto the reddish center for extra depth. I'm using my black velvet brush, but any round brush with a fine tip will work well. I'm adding dots in different sizes to make it more vivid. The key to making this painting so easy is the dry brush technique. You can paint flexibly and nicely with just a few simple strokes, but if you use the same simple strokes with a wet brush, you probably get unwanted solid edges, making the flower look less loose and dreamy. And don't worry if you're making a mistake, or if your paint sprays more than you want. You can always use some opaque white ink to correct it. And white ink won't damage your painting when using the dry brush technique like this. Firstly, we need to wait until the paper's dry. Then I'm using a very dry brush to apply the white ink. And next, brush it in the direction of the petal. You can also add a second layer if you want a more opaque effect. For the finishing touch, I'm adding some dreamy dot elements to the background. These dots create a sense of depth and atmosphere around the flower. I'm varying the size and density of the dots. I'm painting darker and more concentrated dots near the flower, with the dots gradually becoming lighter and more scattered as they move outward. Dry brush technique doesn't seem to be the first lesson to learn when you're just starting out with watercolor. Personally, I think people often associated watercolor painting with using a good amount of water to achieve smooth blends, soft edges, and transparent layers. However, I definitely think if you're starting out, you should give this dry brush technique a go, as there's no need to practice a lot in water control, color mixing techniques, etc. It's particularly effective for flowers with textured petals. That's all for today, and I hope if you enjoyed this tutorial and found these techniques helpful, do give this flower a try, and I'd love to see your versions if you'd like to share them. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.